From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and ahead today, K-State's Curtis Thompson is along to cover the recommended herbicide options for treatment of annual weeds in the fall ahead of corn or grain sorghum, primarily featuring the use of atrazine in combination with other products, depending on the weed challenge in question. Also today, K-State's Art Barnaby will discuss what he says are misperceptions that are being publicized about USDA Crop Program Payments. He points to data that K-State has just compiled on the recent ARC and PLC payments on 2016 production. And K-State's Charlie Lee will profile the Pileated Woodpecker and the role it plays in the woodlands ecosystem here in Kansas. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State research and extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
We've more on fall weed control tactics for you now, and particularly those of you growers who are intending to go to corn or grain sorghum with a given acreage this next spring. This is a great time, our guest says, to get on top of those annual weed problems you might anticipate. Curtis Thompson is a weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension. In fact, there is more than a decent window at which one can apply a treatment here in the fall, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Eric, and a pleasure to be here. You know, we like fall application for a couple of reasons. We have cooler temperatures. Herbicides are going to be degrading slower, and it's less common to have large rainfalls or excessive rain from here on through the rest of the season. We're kind of getting into a bit of a drier period, and so by putting herbicides on in November, for example, with the coolness, we can have some good extended residual control of emerging weeds.
And while we're talking about the advantages of a fall treatment, the chances for off-target issues are much less this time of the year, right?
Well, yeah, when the leaves fall off the deciduous trees and the grapevines and all those things, if we happen to have a little growth regulator in the air, I mean, it's never good, but it's not going to cause as much of a problem. And also with cooler temperatures, these herbicides do stay home a lot better. So, yeah, November coming up here can be an excellent time to use these products.
As always, Kurt, we're drawing from the research-based Chemical Weed Control Guide for Field Crops from K-State, and as we comment about the alternatives here, and the kingpin, if you will, around which a number of these treatments are centered would be atrazine, right?
Yeah, absolutely. For corn and sorghum, when you do use atrazine in the fall, it's going to restrict what you can come back with in the spring, and it does lock you into either corn or grain sorghum. Atrazine has excellent activity on a number of weeds that might be germinating from here and on. It also has some foliar activity. But most of the time when we're putting atrazine on, we do have other herbicides that we're going to include with the atrazine to help control some of the emerged weeds post-emergence. And we're primarily targeting this time of year our winter annuals. Some of these winter annuals actually can be very difficult to manage in the spring if we don't do anything in the fall. And a couple of examples of that are mare's tail and henbit. And if we are treating those in the fall, they're fairly newly emerged. They're actually pretty easy to control. So you can throw 2,4-D or dicamba in the mix. If you've got a lot of winter annual grasses, I would encourage you to throw in the glyphosate glyphosate is extremely effective. And you'd say, well, atrazine should control some of those grasses. It can, but it is very dependent upon the grass size. If it has much of a root system on it, we won't get it controlled with atrazine, whereas if you throw a little glyphosate in the mix, it'll get those winter annual grasses.
Now, to remind, atrazine and glyphosate can antagonize each other. So are there special considerations if one's going that route?
They can cause some antagonism. Most of the time when we get concerned about antagonism with atrazine and glyphosate would be in the summer on some of the difficult-to-control broadleaf weeds, for example, morning glories, velvet leaf. Then we can really see the evidence of antagonism. Most of our winter annual grasses are very susceptible to glyphosate. So, if you're using the 3/4 pound acid equivalent of glyphosate with atrazine, that should be sufficient to control the weeds that we're targeting.
Atrazine does provide that potential for residual control as well. We might want to talk about the realistic expectations there, Kurt.
Yeah, absolutely. When we put atrazine down, especially in November or maybe even into early December, we do have some extended residual control out of atrazine. It can clearly help any later emerging, for example, mare's tail. We know that mare's tail can continue to germinate on into the spring. Another weed that we can target, especially in the western half of the state, is good old kochia. Mm-hmm. Kochia is an early germinator. It can be germinating as early as late February. Well, sometimes our weather isn't conducive in the spring to get some of those early treatments out. We have been doing some work with late November, early December applications of products like atrazine, and we've got a few others that can be quite effective at controlling some of those early germinating kochia.
So that is an extra consideration, particularly as difficult as the kochia battle has been for a number of our growers out there. If one is definitely going to corn next spring, there may be some additional options, you say.
Yeah, we have some HPPD inhibitors that are labeled that, again, would restrict you specifically to corn. Scoparia is a good example. That is basically a balance. Now in corn we use Balance Flex, but we can use Scoparia this late fall and provide some control, perhaps of kochia, up to when we're planting our corn in April. Of course, Corvus is basically the balance plus another grass herbicide, ALS grass herbicide, thioncarbazone methyl. That too can also provide control of kochia about up to when we're planting our corn. So those would be a couple of additional options. We've also explored some treatments like Authority MTZ, that's the metribuzin, and sulfentrazone can also be fairly effective. We've done a little work with Zidua. Zidua is basically, I call it's like a chlorocetamide, and it too has extended control of kochia. So there are some herbicides that we can be applying, again, late fall to try to catch those early germinating kochia in late February, early March.
Back to the atrazine, though, if that's the core product that one is going to use. You do have one footnote to bring to producers' attention. By label, one can only apply so much atrazine in a given calendar year, correct?
That's correct, and that is 2.5 pounds. And so they have to look back, and if there was any atrazine used in this calendar year, that total atrazine application can't exceed 2.5 pounds. Any single application of atrazine cannot exceed 2 pounds. So, if they're going to put some atrazine down this fall, if they haven't had any on, they could put 2 pounds on. I would say that probably isn't that common. Pound and a half can give us a lot of good residual control.
Very well. Once more, of course, everything is covered regarding fall treatment against annual weeds ahead of corn and grain sorghum in the Chemical Weed Control Guide from K-State. The 2017 edition is out there online or through your local extension office. But again, producers have roughly up until the ground freezes to put most of these, if not all, on, do they not, Kurt?
Yes, and of course, a lot of times our ground may freeze, and given a few days of warm weather and it thaws back out. But we want to avoid herbicide applications on frozen ground. Frozen ground in conjunction with precipitation, in the form of rainfall, can create some problems of off-target movement from these herbicides to wherever that water runs.
So good stewardship is still in play here, without question.
Absolutely, and that's true with atrazine in general. There are watersheds where we have concerns about atrazine, and there are some restrictions that apply to those areas above and beyond anything we've talked about here.
That said, late October and November, great opportunity for putting down these herbicides against the annual weeds you would anticipate could pressure your corn and grain sorghum to be planted next spring. Kurt, as always, we appreciate the summary. Thank you.
Great being here.
He is Kurt Thompson, a weed management specialist, K-State Research and Extension, on controlling annual weeds with fall-applied herbicides ahead of corn and grain sorghum. Incidentally, there is an article on this very topic in the latest Agronomy e-update newsletter from K-State dated this past Friday, October the 13th. You can have a glance at that at agronomy.ksu.edu. This is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. And Mike's side once again is a risk management specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Art Barnaby, on a collection of things important to you producers, including a series of crop insurance workshops that K-State is involved with coming up quite soon. Details shortly on those. Also, we'll talk about an analysis of the payments to the Agricultural Risk Coverage Program that Art and his colleagues have recently posted to the agmanager.info website. More on that in a few moments. But tell us about these workshops, Art. These are an annual event, 4 locations, 4 land-grant universities cooperating, correct?
Yes, it's the Crop Insurance Workshop. We've been running this for several years now. It's cooperation between us, Colorado State University, University of Nebraska, and Oklahoma State University. There is continuing ed credit offered to crop agents who need continuing ed for maintaining their license. I know we have license numbers for the 4 states, plus I think Wyoming. So you can check with us if you're from a state that's not listed as having continuing ed credit. I wouldn't promise you that we can file, but I wouldn't rule it out either.
Producers are encouraged to take part in this as well.
Yeah, and interesting enough, we've gotten more producers in recent history to come to this workshop because it's really has nothing to do with how you fill out an insurance claim or how do you write up a contract. No, this is really economic analysis. We're dealing with public policy. As most folks know, there are a lot of critics now of crop insurance who want to move crop insurance funds to their favorite program. What this really is about is the public policy and the decision-making and the economics of crop insurance, and we think that applies to farmers, lenders, as well as crop agents. We also see that crop agent as being an extension of our education efforts because they provide a lot of this information to their own producers who can't attend this workshop.
Yeah. And we will run through the dates and locations specifically in just a moment, but a registration deadline is established for each. It's 5 days ahead of the event itself. So in the case of the workshop in Kansas, in Salina, that would be October the 27th, not that far from now, Art.
Yeah, and doesn't mean we're not going to take your registration fee, but we're going to give you a discount if you register with us early. If you register before the 5 days are up, which is the 27th in the case of Kansas, it varies by the other states depending on when the actual workshop is. But the 27th, and that's also going to be true for Oklahoma because the weekend we won't be there. But nonetheless, it's $100. If you come in late, it's $120. The reason we do that is, one, to encourage you to enroll up front, and two, it gives us a harder count on the numbers because we have to match meal counts and make sure we've got sufficient room and sufficient handouts. So no reason not to register early. I might point out you can register online. We did in the past take credit card, but they're not taking them this year. So all the registrations actually go through the University of Nebraska. I know some of you, particularly back in the old days when they used to be in the Big 12, we hated to send money to Nebraska, but I assure you this thing is all split up between the universities at the end and everybody gets their costs covered. So it's not like you're funding the Nebraska football team.
Okay, very good. Once again, the information is posted on agmanager.info, but specifically the dates. There's a workshop in each of the 4 cooperating states, October the 31st, Brush, Colorado, November the 1st at Grand Island, Nebraska. Then the session here in Kansas, November the 2nd, that will take place in Salina. And finally, November the 3rd in Enid, Oklahoma. All details, including the path to registration, covered on agmanager.info, the 2017 Crop Insurance Workshops co-sponsored. Art, earlier you noted that there, again, are some proposals out there to do away with or severely reduce the funding for the crop insurance coverage as part of the deliberations over this next farm bill. And you have some comments, obviously, about that, and then complement that with some new information that you've posted on the returns to the Agricultural Risk Coverage Program.
Yes, the paper I'm referring to has come out from the American Enterprise Institute. There's 4 authors on these papers, and they are very severe critics, and not just crop insurance. They want to eliminate the Title I programs, ARC and PLC. They want to eliminate crop insurance. They imply that there's big dollars being paid out here. I'm sure by now everyone has seen the headlines that the government paid out $8 billion in Title I payments, ARC and PLC. But in the real world, $8 billion doesn't get you very much. It's rounding error in the federal budget. So I prefer to look at what does this look like at the farm level.
And you've done just that through this analysis.
In excruciating detail, and that's why we're going to put all this information that I'm looking at here today that's still in a table format into a map to make it easier for people to see the relevance of these payments. First of all, on the website right now is maps that show the actual payment made by FSA. Now, I know FSA has something very similar to that on their website, so we have to do something a little different, which I think is kind of useful. Robin has posted the payments by county, but posted the payments, the aggregate payments for all 3 years.
Robin Reed, your colleague in agricultural economics.
Yes. And in this case, you've got some counties that got the maximum payment every year for the first 3 years. You got some other counties that didn't get any payment, and then you got some counties that may only got one payment out of the 3 years. So it's quite enlightening to look at those maps and see what the payments look like in total. Now, the thing is that total payment is the RMA payment that they put out there. The payment they put out there is, think of it as the gross payment. And I think that's the way the $8 billion is come up with. They take that payment rate that FSA comes up with, and cross all the base acres and come up with that payment. Well, first of all, you got some base acres that won't get paid because they're over the adjusted gross income limit. Secondly, they'll be over the payment limit itself, and that'll take out some acres. But let's say you're a farmer and you're under all those limits. That still doesn't mean you're going to get that payment. It's going to be something less than that. And the reason is because on your base acres, there's 15% of those acres that don't receive any payments, and then there's a 6.8% sequestration cut this year, and I think that actually goes up a point next year, that will cut into those payments. So, for example, I was playing around with some numbers in a wheat farm that has a maximum payment of, say, $20 an acre. They would end up with about $15 to $16 an acre because you have to adjust for the 15% of the acres you don't get payments on. You have to adjust for the acres you don't get payments on at all because you have no base on it, and you have to adjust for the sequestration cut. So effectively, it's closer to $15, $16 an acre. Then if you figure that, well, let's say you were one of those few counties that got payments at the maximum in all 3 years. Well, that still doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get a huge number, and I was playing around with the idea you got another payment this year, making 4 payments, but didn't get a payment in the last year. If that turns out to be the case, you got 4 out of 5 years of the maximum payment. By the time you average that across all 5 years, now you're down to something closer to, I don't know, $12 an acre or so, $12, $13 an acre.
Just a little over half of what is perceived out there then, basically.
Yeah. And if you think of that in terms of that, how much of this do I get that I can apply towards my property tax bill? If you're running $4 or $5 an acre property tax, it really doesn't cover your property tax hardly. In fact, you'd be better off if you had a landlord and gave him his third, and it won't cover it for him either. So my point is, when you look at the number on an individual acre basis, it's not near as large as everyone talks about. It's only when you aggregate it up, and then they don't necessarily do all these discounts that happen in the real world before you get to what you actually end up with in your checking account. And that's true with all these programs. Yet when these folks at the national level do their analysis, they always assume on crop insurance, for example, that you get paid the futures price. Well, few people get the futures price because you normally have a negative basis. And if you're in a crop loss situation, usually you get some discounts for quality loss and test weights and all that sort of stuff. Now, crop insurance will cover some of that, but not all of it. And when you get down to the bottom line, that check isn't near as big as you would think. Listen to the experts.
It's not a windfall.
It's not, in my opinion. The other thing they do is when they're calculating incomes and other things, they assume the national average cash price, the so-called farm price. That's the number that we talk about quite often, and I estimate every month, that determines the size of the government payments. The point is, I've had more than one farmer call me, where are you getting that number at? It's way higher than what I'm getting here at the elevator. Yes, absolutely. So I know when you run these numbers, you're not getting revenue as high as what these numbers would suggest you are. So it's the kind of world we live in, and you just need to understand where the numbers are coming from.
So, producers, we'd recommend you take a look at that. These are broken down, of course, county by county, so you can see what this all says about your situation. It's an interactive map, very handy. So it's all at agmanager.info, and all of the information we've covered in this segment, in fact, detailed right there, agmanager.info. Well, Art, thanks so much for all the work and the comments. We'll talk again soon. Risk Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Art Barnaby, with us on Agriculture Today. And more is coming your way in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. Today's agricultural news headlines coming your way now. These courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report reads like this for this week ending October the 15th. Wheat seeding, row crop harvest continued across the state this past week, although interrupted by rain and some reports of soybean pods now shattering. The topsoil moisture supplies this week, 77% adequate and 3% short to very short, 10% surplus. Subsoil moisture, 4% surplus, 74% adequate, and 22% short to very short. Winter wheat planting still lagging well behind at 42%. 75% is the normal progress for this date. Emergence at 25%, again well behind the 46% average. The Kansas corn harvest, 54% complete now. That's well behind the 73% average. Soybean crop condition this week, 44% good to excellent, 37% fair, 19% poor to very poor. And the soybean harvest is 34% in now. That's very near the 36% average for the date. The grain sorghum crop is rated 58% good to excellent, 32% fair, 10% poor to very poor. The sorghum harvest at 13%. That's well behind the 32% average. For the national update on corn and sorghum and soybean harvest progress, we turn now to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says winter is coming.
From the central high plains into the upper Midwest, we saw our first significant cold outbreak and freeze of the season, primarily on October 10th and 11th.
He says the freezing temperatures could affect the 10% of the corn nationwide that's not yet mature.
Among the states that did experience a significant season-ending freeze, we really only had concerns with just a few areas: Wisconsin, the Dakotas, and then moving back on the high plains to Colorado.
He says the corn harvest is behind the averages.
Well, it's been a struggle. We have wet weather at times in the Midwest over the last week, and we have delayed development, so that pushes everything even further behind schedule. Just 28% of this year's corn crop harvested by October 15th. 5-year average is 47%. Last year, 44%.
Meanwhile, corn condition nationwide is 65% good to excellent, which is a slight improvement from last week. Rippey says soybeans weathered freezing temperatures in the Midwest better than corn.
Oftentimes, producers will go after the soybeans and leave the corn in the field in situations like this.
He says nationwide, 94% of soybeans are dropping leaves.
The only state that had really any acreage of note with soybeans not yet dropping leaves was Wisconsin, 92% dropping. 5-year average there is 94%.
He says the soybean harvest nationwide is almost at the halfway mark at 49%.
We saw at least a quarter of the soybeans harvested just during the week in the Dakotas. North Dakota, for example, advancing from 44 to 72% complete. Minnesota had been way behind, but more than doubled its harvest progress from 22 to 45% complete.
Meanwhile, soybean condition is steady at 61% good to excellent and 12% very poor to poor. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And in an expected move, U.S. trade officials have released a proposal to reverse a Canadian pricing program that has negatively affected some U.S. dairy exports into Canada. This proposal demands that Canada eliminate an industry pricing classification that lowered domestic prices for certain milk protein concentrate products to the minimum global price. Canadian Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland says that any effort to undermine Canada's supply management sectors would be a red line in the NAFTA talks. Now for you, this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I want to talk with our Kansas dairy farmers about, preparing for winter, thinking about our cows out there and how we're preparing them to face the winter conditions that will be coming probably sooner than most of us like. So, where do we start? Well, I'd actually really start with considering what we might be doing to help our cows with teat-in condition. You know, it's kind of interesting. If we get about a 15 to 20 degree drop in air temperature, that's when we actually start seeing some chapping of the teat ends. So, for those of you that use winter teat dips, those are the teat dips that have extra teat skin conditioners and extra emollients so that we actually improve the condition of the teat skin. You probably need to consider starting those now rather than later. Oftentimes we wait too long, so we have teat ends that are already chapped and affected by winter weather before we start using those. So I'd encourage you, If you haven't used those in the past, you might consider talking to your dairy supplier about the options that you might have available to you. Give those a try this winter. They really do make a difference. Why do we want to do that? Well, as we chap teat ends, we generally see an increase in somatic cell, and we may see an increase in incidences of mastitis as well as teat end condition worsens through the winter weather. So let's make sure that we give our cows the best protection we can, get them prepared for the winter weather that's coming. Second thing to consider along this line is the travel distance between the milking parlor and the housing area. Many cases we have some open area between our milking parlors and our housing area. So as the animals exit the milking parlor heading toward the housing, what protection do they have from the winds? If we do not have windbreaks installed along these lanes, please consider doing that. Again, as the cows exit the parlor, the teat ends will be especially susceptible to freezing and chapping from that cold wind that might be hitting them. Windbreaks are an excellent way to reduce the amount of cold stress that those teat ends experience as they go from the milking parlor toward their housing area. So again, considering what you might be doing in those areas. Many farmers have done this, and they would tell you that it does really help, especially when we have harsh winter conditions. Granted, those are probably a couple months away, but we need to start thinking about how we're going to handle that, getting those things in place to help the animals through that time. Some other things you might be considering is, as we look forward to winter, we know we're going to need extra bedding, particularly for our dairies that have dry lots, making sure that we have plenty of straw on hand and available in an area where we can get to it is really important. Also, as we start thinking about winter, all of the curtains and things on the sides of our barns, we need to make sure those are actually ready to roll down in good repair, and if not, we've still got a little bit of time to get those sorts of things taken care of. One last note as we prepare for winter, again, for the bedding situation, making sure that our bedding choppers or other systems that we use to deliver bedding to the pen are up and running and ready to go, as well as winterizing all of our equipment that we use on a daily basis. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to start preparing for the winter season now.
All right, Mike, many thanks. This is Agriculture Today. We'll be back after this final break over the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Next for you on this Agriculture Today, wildlife management in the spotlight once more. Here's wildlife specialist K-State Research and Extension Charlie Lee. Charlie, you're going to tell us about a woodpecker and a variation of that bird that's rather large compared to what we normally think of regarding woodpeckers. What's the story?
Today's stock peak will be the Pileated Woodpecker. It's one of the biggest, most strikingly colored birds on the continent. It's nearly the size of a crow. It's black with bold white stripes down the neck and then a very bright flaming red crest. They're fairly loud birds. They're drumming and pecking and whacking at dead trees and fallen logs is some of the first indications that you would have a pileated woodpecker. And they're certainly considered a keystone species in the woodlands, but it's a species that's somewhat uncommon here in Kansas.
When you say keystone species, what does that allude to?
Well, a keystone species is a organism that can influence the ecosystem so that other organisms, whether birds, mammals, can benefit from the presence of the existing species. We've talked about the ability of prairie dogs to modify their habitat, and they were considered a keystone species. They create burrows in the ground. Pileated woodpeckers create burrows in trees that many other species would utilize. Those other species that would utilize the burrows created by pileated woodpeckers could include swifts, owls, wood ducks, bats, and then further north could even include things like pine martens. They not only create that hole as they're looking for food and for nest sites, other species then simply find those locations and are able to utilize what the pileated woodpecker has created.
So the holes are big enough to actually house these other species.
Yeah, the pileated woodpeckers drill very distinctive rectangular-shaped holes in the decaying wood, primarily to feed on ants, usually carpenter ants and other insects. They've got a fairly wide range of food items that they feed on. Carpenter ants have been estimated to be from 40 to 97% of their diets. They will also feed on other wood-boring beetle larvae, termites, flies, caterpillars, grasshoppers. And then during winter, they'll also feed on fruits and nuts. Fruits from species like greenbrier and hackberry and dogwood are commonly consumed by pileated woodpeckers. Occasionally, you will find them up at a bird feeder where they're maybe accessing either seed, but more commonly getting suet during the winter.
You say that their preferred habitat is, well, sensibly enough, forested areas, but particularly those older tree resources.
Yeah, typically the older, more mature woodland habitat that you have, including what some would call old-growth forest, would be the preferred habitat. Anything from 75 years on up would be very commonly used, would be infrequent to find them in younger-aged woodlands.
So we largely find them, as per Kansas, in the eastern part of the state?
The eastern part of the state, somewhere perhaps as far west as Sumner County on a diagonal northeast up towards Kansas City, with a few locations scattered around, including as far north as Riley County. So, again, fairly uncommon, but certainly are found at all months of the year. They're a year-round resident here, and a species that is loud enough, distinct enough, that people should take notice of them.
And they're pecking, as you say, quite aggressive to the point where they'll perforate a tree from bottom to top.
Well, occasionally there's big rectangular burrows that they create, would be down low to the bottom of the tree, all the way up to the top. Sometimes they'll be side by side, and it's certainly unusual to see this rectangular opening because it's the only bird out there that creates that rectangular opening in trees. Sometimes those trees are standing dead trees. Sometimes those openings will be in downed wood, but most of the time you're going to find those in locations of a dead branch or a snag on an existing live, very mature tree.
So when we think of categorizing the damage, it could be mostly to the value of that tree as a timber source.
Yes, I hear timber buyers are concerned about that size of an opening in the tree. There are other woodpeckers out there that may create shallow openings in trees, but a pileated woodpecker is not something that folks that are growing trees for sale for lumber are very excited to see. I think we're fortunate that they're not a species that is high density, but in the individual trees that they choose to inhabit, that burrow can extend in there up to 2 foot in depth. And when you've got an opening perhaps the size that you can stick your fist in, that can damage a lot of wood and reduce the value of that tree, which is reducing the value of that landowner's woodland.
So will they go after wood-sided homes, perhaps?
Well, that's not anything that I've found in the literature that occurs. I would guess that they could, but again, they have a kind of a very distinct preference for old, mature woodlands, and I think a home is not something that they're likely to damage.
So, by and large, unless one is in the business of raising timber for sale, then it's not a great worry, this woodpecker.
No, I don't consider it a worry because they're not that frequently observed. They have low density, so most people, I think, should appreciate the value of this species has to our ecosystem and appreciate the habitat that they can create. The damage is minor except for a few individual trees throughout the woodland, and I think they're unique enough that people should appreciate them for the value that they can provide.
And that's a look at the pileated woodpecker. Now, if there are concerns about woodpecker damage, generally speaking, whether it's pileated or otherwise, why, next week we'll talk about some preventative measures to minimize that damage in this time slot. For now, Charlie, thanks for being with us. As always, wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. That is our time for today. We appreciate you being along with us, as always. We'll be back this same time tomorrow. Hope you'll rejoin us then as well. In the meantime, a good day to you. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.